Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. I am also, by the way, a fellow at the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations. I have been for the last couple of years, and it's a real pleasure to welcome onto the podcast this week David Firetsein, who has a rich background that we talk a little bit about on the podcast, but I think it suffices to say in this intro that he's the inaugural president and CEO of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations. We spend a little bit of time talking about David's background and about the foundation itself in the podcast, but we spend most of our time trying to bring an objective lens to U.S. China relations. That said, and we say this in the podcast, I want to lay our biases on the table, and I certainly have a very strong bias when it comes to U.S. China relations, which is I don't want the U.S. and China to fight a war in my lifetime, and certainly not in my children's lifetime. I think that would be terrible for the United States, terrible for China, and honestly unnecessary. I think a lot of the disagreement between the U.S. and China is because of a mutual unintelligibility between the two sides. And David and I really talk about some of that and about some of these irreconcilable differences and some of the avenues that are there for improved communication. So we lay that on the table sort of at the very beginning and then try and from an objective perspective get into U.S.-China relations. But this is also something that is something close to my heart. I don't think the U.S. and China should be enemies, and to the extent that I have a platform or can have a platform, at least encouraging understanding and clear-sighted understanding of the objectives of both sides, I think that's something worthwhile and something important to do, and hopefully as a contribution to both the objectivity of anybody listening, but also for myself and having that discipline going forward. So that's the show. It's a really great conversation with David. As usual, Jacob at cognitive.investments. If you want to send me an email about what we do at CI or about this podcast or about anything else that is on your mind, cheers and see you out there. Cognitive Investments, LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. David, I've been wanting to have you on the podcast for literally years now, and it's so nice to actually get together and do it. So thank you so much for taking some time to do so.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jacob. It's really a pleasure to be with you. I always enjoy our conversations.
I want to talk about the foundation. I want to talk about U.S. China relations, but I thought I would just start by asking you to give the listeners kind of a little bit of a background on sort of where you come from and what your background is too, because I think it's almost as interesting your take on U.S. China relations today as how you got to sort of being in a position to talk about U.S. China relations. So just give us some brief background on how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Jacob. In terms of my professional background, I was a U.S. diplomat for 18 years, coming right out of graduate school, and degrees in international relations and public policy and Asian studies. And I served overseas at U.S. embassies in Beijing and Moscow for a total of 9 years, and also served about 9 years at State Department headquarters in Washington. So for about 18 years, I was very much involved in U.S. diplomacy, both overseas and in Washington. I then had the opportunity to go into the think tank world, and I worked as ultimately senior vice president at the East-West Institute of Foreign Policy and Track 2 Diplomacy nonprofit based in Manhattan in New York City, and did that for 8 years, and that was really interesting. I had the opportunity there to work on U.S. China relations and U.S. Russia relations at the same time, and also worked a bit on North Korea and Iran and Afghanistan as well in the same job. So that was a really interesting 8 years. And then I had the opportunity to come down to the University of Texas and found and establish the University of Texas at Austin China Public Policy Center. And I served on the LBJ School's graduate faculty for a couple of years, and had a great experience with that work. And now I'm at the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations, and I'm the founding, or the inaugural rather, president and CEO of the organization, and had the good fortune of meeting the organization's founder and chairman of the board, Neil Bush, a few years ago, and one thing led to another, and he very graciously extended the offer to join this organization as the inaugural president and CEO, and I was delighted and very honored to do that. So I would say the through line in my career has been U.S. China relations and China more generally. I've also worked very much in depth on U.S. Russia relations and a number of other issues, but I would say the U.S. China is the one thing that I think has been the constant in my career of just over 30 years.
And it's really, I mean, you've sort of been, I guess this is true in sort of every era, but I mean, you've had a front row seat for some pretty seismic changes in how the US deals with foreign policy. I feel like we went from, Cold War to unipolar moment to whatever moment we're in right now. Does it feel kind of like whiplash, or does it all feel like one continuous, like slow moving evolution from where you sit?
Well, when you put it that way, it is really remarkable. I joined the Foreign Service and entered public service and during the presidency of George H.W. Bush, who was, of course, the U.S. president who presided over the end of the Cold War. And now here we are, 30 some years later at a very different juncture in the history of international relations and diplomacy. And it has been an incredible journey, I have to say. And um, it's been an honor to be a part of the U.S. government for a good swath of that period, but also it's been gratifying to work in a think tank or nonprofit sense on a lot of these issues. And of course, the issues have changed and evolved over that period of time. And obviously, America's thinking about China has evolved very dramatically over that period of time, and even more specifically in more recent years. And so, yeah, I just kind of try to fasten my seatbelt and hang on for dear life because it is a very different world that we're dealing with now. A lot of the challenges are seen differently, framed differently, understood differently, but they're still there. And I'm still very gratified and glad that I chose to work on China professionally many years ago.
You're not. My follow up to that was going to be: do you ever feel frustrated? Because I feel like U.S.-China relations. I mean, let's be frank; they're not particularly good right now, and it doesn't feel like the trajectory is particularly good. Is there any sense of frustration for how things like China and the U.S. can't seem to get out of each other's own way when dealing with each other, or are you still fundamentally optimistic, sort of, about the long term future?
Well, that's a great question. And, honestly, there certainly are moments of frustration to see two countries that are so important to the world and to each other, struggle to such a degree to maintain a relationship that's functional and constructive and results oriented, mutually beneficial, and above all, politically sustainable. I mean, it's tough to see that as someone who's been very deeply involved in working on this relationship professionally for a long time. So yes, there's no question that I do feel some frustration around, what's happened with the relationship and the seeming inability of either country or both countries really to get the relationship back onto a more constructive track. That being said, if anything, I think it just means that the need and the market for the kind of work that we do at the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations is, if anything, greater than it has ever been. The urgency of the work, I think, is greater. The degree of difficulty, I think, is also greater, and that's where some of the frustration comes in. But I still believe that this relationship is worth fighting for, and I still believe that that is so not out of any altruistic sentiment, but out of a notion that America's self-interests demand that we have a functional and constructive relationship with China, and the reverse of that is also true. So the frustration is unquestionably there, but the sense of commitment to mission and the sense of the importance and resonance of what we're doing is also very high, and that's one of the things that I think keeps me motivated.
Yeah. And correct me if I'm wrong. So the foundation, I think it was founded in sort of summer 2017, but really only launched public facing around the fall of 2019. Is that correct?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Was it sort of in the works already? Was the sort of trade war between the United States and China and the real deterioration in the relationship, which, I mean, I would say it began really during the late Obama administration. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but was it something that had sort of been percolating for a while, or was it really in some ways a response to what seemed like a very present, clear and deterioration in U.S. China relations?
That's a great question. And the answer is it really was not a response to developments in the relationship, but it really was kind of the natural continuation of the lifelong interest that President George H.W. Bush had in China and in the U.S. China relationship. And in his post presidency, President George H.W. Bush um, created, working closely with his son Neil and other partners, created a George H.W. Bush conference on U.S. China relations and personally co chaired that conference for, I believe, six iterations of the conference before his health declined and he was unable to continue doing so, at which point he handed the reins over to Neil. So really the impetus for the creation and full operationalization of the foundation had its roots in those conferences and in President George H.W. Bush's personal involvement and lifelong interest in doing what he could to keep this relationship moving in the right direction. And ultimately, Neil, with the full blessing and involvement of his father, decided to kind of institutionalize those efforts to bring the United States and China together through this conference by creating a more fully functioning foundation. And again, with the blessing and involvement of his father, Neil founded the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations, essentially in its current form. And that was really more just to institutionalize this effort to create a trusted channel of communication between the United States and China, but not a particular reaction to specific developments in the relationship. So the roots of this really go back about 20 years, even though our founding occurred, as you rightly noted, in 2017, and then full operations began in 2019.
Yeah, that almost feels like a long time ago. I often say on this podcast, I try to be an objective geopolitical analyst in all of my written work and all of my podcast work and how I sort of present myself in general. But I do have biases. And one of my biggest biases is that I think a bad U.S. China relationship, or even in the long term, a U.S. China war, God forbid, I'm against that. I want that not to happen, and I'll do whatever I can to try and prevent that from happening. And I think that's one of the reasons you guys invited me to be a fellow at the foundation when it launched, and I leapt at the chance because even though it's a little bit different than most of the stuff that I normally do, I mean, and this is a way to sort of to ask you to talk a little bit about what the foundation does, because it can sound kind of amorphous being a trusted channel and things like that, but some of the conversations that you guys have set up between me and other folks in the United States and folks in China, just to talk, just to ask, hey, what do you think about this? What do I think about this? And we can look at each other across the Zoom screen, and it can be completely not actually speaking two different languages, but we're articulating completely different worldviews. But just the fact that those conversations are happening and that the foundation is enabling those conversations to happen, I don't know. It's one of the few things that gives me some hope for the future. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And we're lucky that you're a part of this team as well, Jacob, and just the incredible insights that you bring to your work and your writings and your analysis. And I would say I share the same biases that you just articulated. I think it's really important, vitally important for the United States to have a relationship with China that at a minimum is functional and hopefully is also constructive, mutually beneficial, and so on. To have a dysfunctional relationship or a relationship that, God forbid, veers toward conflict is absolutely not in the United States' interest. And like I and my colleagues at the foundation do everything that we can to try to keep this relationship on the rails to the extent that we can as a small nonprofit entity. And, just to your point about, or your question about kind of the activities of the foundation, in essence, our mission is to advance U.S. China relations in ways that reflect the ethos, spirit, and values of President George H.W. Bush. And he believed that the U.S. China relationship is the single most consequential bilateral relationship in the world. And I would even go further and say in the history of the world. And number two, that virtually no global policy challenge of any magnitude can be enduringly or effectively addressed in the absence of U.S.-China cooperation, along with the involvement of other stakeholders. So, that's what animates the work that we do. And We try to create platforms for honest dialogue between key individuals in the United States and key individuals in China, sometimes involving officials, always involving people who are influential in both countries, even if they're not currently in power. We work to address some of the toughest issues in the relationship, but also to try to find areas where there may be a real opportunity for collaboration, notwithstanding the incredible tensions that dominate the relationship and shape the tenor of the relationship in so many ways. But we work on issues like, we've had dialogues on issues like the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. Taiwan is a recurring theme in our work. We bring scholars together. We bring politicos, if you will, from both sides together. We now have a program that's actually supported by the U.S. State Department to bring basically an intergenerational group of folks together, people in their 20s and people in their 60s and 70s, and have a kind of cross-generational dialogue on the issues to kind of air out what the differences are generationally between people who care about this relationship. And we were very proud to have U.S. government support for that. We have a dialogue on between the United States and China on, as odd as it may sound, it's kind of a niche area, but digital health delivery, which is an area which is by design apolitical and not something that's caught up in the U.S. China tensions that we've seen, to such a degree over the last several years. So it's a wide range of issues, but we're very selective about the issues that we work on. And for the most part, we try to work on issues that at least create the potential for our dialogue to have some meaningful positive impact. Things that are completely intractable, as a general rule, we don't work on as much because we recognize the futility of that. So we're selective about the issues that we work on. It's an interesting and I think innovative programmatic agenda. And there's a market for it, and we have buy-in from both the U.S. government, the Chinese government, various other stakeholders in both countries, and it encourages us to keep doing what we're doing.
Recognizing that Chinese civil society and China's political system is obviously completely different than the United States, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Are there any similar organizations or analogous organizations in China itself? Like, is there a Deng Xiaoping Foundation for Better U.S. China Relations or anything that sort of resembles that at all? Or is it just sort of a completely different animal in China, and you interact with sort of whoever and whatever you can in order to further those lines of communication?
Well, I would say there really isn't an exact analog. There certainly are organizations in China that we work with closely, starting with government officials, the Chinese Communist Party itself, the military, but also major academic organizations, universities, think tanks, the business community, nonprofits. And so we have a very wide range of counterparts, if you will, in China for the various things that we do. I would say mostly we're working with academic organizations and nonprofits, but again, we do have strong relationships with the various powers that be, again, depending on what the issue set requires in terms of a counterpart. I don't, as you rightly point out, I think it would be fair to say that China's nonprofit world, in a number of important respects, differs from our nonprofit world, where independence, editorial independence is so important to us. Being able to, as you noted earlier, kind of call it like we see it and be dispassionate and be objective and be fact-based, be science-based. And go to where the facts take us. That's something that is vitally important. It's an indispensable part of our organizational identity. And I think our record of public statements and our overall positioning on a whole host of issues bears that out. At the same time, looking at the Chinese side, I think it is harder, generally speaking, for nonprofits in China and non-governmental organizations, sometimes referred to as GONGOs or GONGOs, government organized non-governmental organizations. It's harder for them to stake out that same kind of independence because of the nature of the Chinese system, and I certainly understand that. That being said, Jacob, one thing I would note is that there is some level of independence in a number of the organizations that we have been able to work with, and I'll just give you one brief example. I just published something I rarely do, by the way. I just published a scholarly article in a refereed journal, one of China's preeminent foreign affairs journals, and I had some comments in the article that were critical of, and I would say very directly and bluntly critical of certain Chinese positions or practices. And all of that was left in the article when it was published. None of it was stripped out. None of it was censored. None of it was, edited to be, more, less critical and so on. And so, I respect that. I respect the fact that there are areas where you can, level fact-based criticism and have that criticism stand on the record, even in China. And of course, we can do that here in the United States as well. So, we have a lot of respect for the organizations that we work with. And even when we don't necessarily see issues eye to eye, we value the opportunity to engage in an honest way and to know that we're all coming at it in good faith. And that those are core values at the heart of what we do.
Yeah, and that's a great segue because, maybe you should publish more often because it was a terrific article. I kind of want to send it far and wide, but it sort of focuses on trust in the U.S. China relationship. And I was really, maybe I can just sort of tee you up there. You sort of identify 6 sources of mistrust in the U.S. China relationship. And I want to really talk about doctrine because in some ways that's, to me, the stickiest and the hardest to kind of unravel. But maybe just talk about why you think there is so much mistrust in the U.S. China relationship from that sort of fundamental level.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate that. As I mentioned in this article, and it's actually been something I've talked about for about a decade, or even really dating back to 2009. I first laid these thoughts out at the University of Washington in December of 2009, but only last month had them, committed to publication in a refereed journal. So that was nice to see that come to fruition. But in essence, I do think there are multiple layers or levels, or to put it differently, sources of mistrust in the relationship between the United States and China. And I think we don't always articulate those, and therefore we don't understand them, and we don't understand the impact that these things have on the trust element in the relationship. So civilizational factors, civilizational and cultural, I would say, doctrinal factors, ideological, or I would say ideological, even more fundamentally than doctrinal factors, which I'll talk about more in a second, national interests, and then national style, just the ways that countries go about operating and acting and speaking, and leading to the way we talk about foreign policy. All of those different elements, I think, have a bearing on the overall levels of trust. And my argument is that at each of these levels, there are things that are creating impediments to the formation and sustenance of trust in the relationship between the United States and China. At the doctrinal level, I would say that, as you note, that is an important piece of the puzzle. And, if I were just taking this really big topic and summarizing it very succinctly, I think, you don't need to look further than the fact that in U.S. doctrine, written doctrine that you see in our national security strategy, which comes out about every 4 years, and our Defense Department documents and others, the United States says as a matter of doctrine that the United States aspires to a global position of primacy and essentially supremacy, that we want to be the biggest, baddest, toughest, strongest player, and that we want to be in a position to dominate world affairs, in essence, certainly to have that capacity in terms of our national power and in particular in terms of our military power. And China, as a matter of its doctrine, its declared doctrine, aspires to multipolarity. Some would argue that China aspires to more than that, but I think it's very clear that at a minimum it wants multipolarity and co-equal status with the United States and with Europe, Russia, Japan, and other uh, sort of pole level players in the global system. And right there, you have an irreconcilable tension between the United States and China, because the United States wants something other than equality, and China wants equality. The United States wants primacy and supremacy, and China wants to be a peer, a co-equal peer of the United States. And right there, that is irreconcilable as a matter of doctrine. So I think there are some pretty deep issues at the level of doctrine, but also even below that level, and if you will, above that level, that contribute to what I think now is a historically low level of mutual trust, which is to say a high level of mutual mistrust between the United States and China.
When do you think that happened in the United States? Because it seems to me that, when Nixon and Kissinger cooked up the reconciliation with China in the early 1970s, I think part of the reason that happened, well, part of it was because, they identified the Soviet Union as a greater threat than China, and they wanted to have cooperation with the People's Republic of China to push back against the Soviet Union. But if you go back and read sort of Nixon's speeches, he's cool with multipolarity. He sort of already takes it for granted that the U.S. is not a power that can aspire to primacy, but that it can sort of define its interests and work in a more multipolar world. And somewhere between Nixon and I guess between the neocons, it feels like the United States kind of went off the rails a little bit there. And I wonder if that happened while you were in foreign service or government or things like that, whether you think it happened before, whether the Nixon thing was just kind of a random moment in time. We'll get to China in a second, because I think that's an important one too. But when do you think the U.S. sort of lost the doctrinal malleability to allow for other peer powers to exist alongside it versus that primacy argument that you articulated, and which you can go read, as you rightly point out, in the National Security Strategy?
It's a really great question, Jacob. There's a lot of depth to that. And I think, just as a preface to what I would say in response, looking at Nixon era doctrine and looking at contemporary doctrine would be a very interesting thing to do. I don't profess to be a scholar per se in academia in a full-time sense, but so I don't know if someone's looked at this, but I think the evolution that you're talking about would be a very instructive and interesting area to delve into and to isolate in a more methodologically rigorous way. But my kind of shorthand answer to your question is, I think with the demise of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991 and the end of the Cold War, the end of the Warsaw Pact, the Velvet Revolution, which really started in the late 80s and certainly 1989, and all of that period that kind of brought an end to the Cold War, brought an end to the Soviet Union, in a sense made Russia, the Russian Federation, our friend, and really a good friend of our nation, if you will, in the early to mid-1990s. And the notion that the United States at that point really sat alone at the top of the heap globally as the sort of sole survivor. I mean, we were the sole superpower as of, essentially 1991, 1992. And I think without having kind of studied it in depth in the way that I think would be very valuable for someone to do, my gut tells me that when we reached that unipolar moment, America's thinking about our rightful place in the world started to shift, and unipolarity and primacy and supremacy became, in a sense, the inevitable results of that analysis. Our major, co-equal peer competitor, the Soviet Union, was no longer there. And so now, starting in 1991, 1992, we started to look at the world differently. So I think that would be a good place to start, to sort of look at where this notion of primacy and supremacy really started to take hold within American strategic thinking. I think it's been there to one degree or another since 1945, but again, the impediment to acting upon this sentiment was the Soviet Union. And once the Soviet Union disappeared from the scene, then I think that opened up some vistas for the United States in terms of our doctrine. So my guess is that would be a good place to start looking to answer your question.
Do you think there's any space for the United States to reconsider that position, or do you think that that is just sort of now locked in and ingrained? I mean, I guess that just the fact that we shifted from multipolarity to unipolarity means that we can shift back to multipolarity. But it just seems to me that there is resistance on both sides of the aisle. You can find this in sort of Trump statements. It's right there in Biden's statements too, staring us all in the face. Like it doesn't seem to me like there's enough flexibility to conceptualize a world in which the United States is not the top dog. Do you think there's enough flexibility in the foreign policy establishment and the top levels of government to accept that truth, or is there something about having gotten this close to the sun that we're always going to feel like we should be entitled to that position?
I think it's the latter. And I think that what drives it is the politics, because no one in this country, no candidate for president or president, no one in the Senate who's contemplating a presidential run, et cetera, wants to be that person that goes out to the cornfields of Iowa or, to New Hampshire and makes the argument that, a centerpiece of his or her foreign policy will be that, we should not aspire to being number one in the world. We should not aspire to being exceptional. We should not aspire to being the most powerful. We should learn to live with co-equality and peer status with China, with Russia. I mean, leaving aside the merits of the argument, and as you rightly point out, both Democrats and Republicans have both bought into this idea, but also there are critical voices in both parties that have taken exception to the idea of American supremacy. In fact, there are elements of many things that President Trump said and candidate Donald Trump said that are very much in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
The notion that we shouldn't be overseas fighting everybody's wars, that we should bring our troops back, that we should focus on America and so forth. These take this foreign policy thinking in a different direction. But in this moment in American politics, at this particular juncture, I just don't think anyone is going to want to go out and put as the centerpiece of their, doctrinal thinking or foreign policy thinking, the idea that America shouldn't aspire to be the best, the biggest, the baddest, the strongest, the toughest, and so on. So, I think anyone that does that is going to be pummeled politically and probably soundly defeated politically, because that's not where sentiment is in this country. And I think that is the constraint. I think the politics is the constraint. I think there are people who, in this country, patriotic Americans, former military, current military, policymakers, former policymakers, think tankers, and others, who raise real questions as to whether the United States should aspire to primacy in the year 2023. But I would say the mainstream argument across the partisan aisle is steady as she goes, and I think the politics is a big factor that drives that.
Yeah. It's funny when you talked about comparing the contradictions in President Trump versus candidate Trump. I can't, before I sort of got into geopolitics and I thought I was going to be an academic, I was very much a Straussian and enchanted with sort of the philosophy and work of Leo Strauss, whose main work that people know him for is Persecution in the Art of Writing. And he had this idea that the great geniuses of history, going all the way back to Plato, had to couch their revolutionary ideas in contradiction. And so that the real science of reading philosophy is to compare. You have to find the contradictions in the great writers' work and then work out, well, what did they actually mean? Because, they're trying to signal something. And there's this idea of trying to use that approach to parsing the contradictions of Donald Trump, the candidate, versus the president, just made me chuckle a little bit. I had to mute the microphone for a second, but that's neither here nor there. I wanted to turn then to sort of China and the other side of that doctrinal question. And I'm going to sort of give an absurd sort of political scenario to try and tease out this question. Let's say, for the sake of argument, I don't think this is going to happen. This is a hypothetical, but let's say for the sake of argument, China took over Taiwan and reclaimed Vladivostok and whatever lands the Russians took from them in the late 1890s from Russia, got all of the different territories that they think that they're entitled to on the 9-dash line, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Would China stop there, or would China keep going?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think the short answer to that theoretical question is my gut tells me, my understanding of China, my study of the country and so forth, tells me that China does not seek to be a U.S. style or even a Soviet style imperial power um, with military assets all over the world, bases in hundreds of locations and 150 countries. You know, the ability to put boots on the ground in hours or days at any location on the planet Earth. I just don't think that is what China aspires to. There are probably, in fact, I'm sure there are people in the United States that think that that is what China aspires to.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't. And I think most people that understand China well understands that China doesn't seek to be the United States 2.0. It seeks to be who it is. And yes, China regards certain issues as being unresolved, obviously Taiwan and a few issues around its borders. I don't think, in my judgment, again, recognizing that your question is, as you acknowledged, is far, is predicated in a far-fetched premise. I don't think China has aspirations for Vladivostok or any Russian territory beyond whatever specific border issues have remained unresolved on its periphery. Taiwan is the big one, but other than that, I think China is content within its sovereign boundaries. Now, it takes a view of its sovereign boundaries that is different than that of the United States or other neighbors or other countries, or for that matter, the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, international law, and so on. And I think that many of China's claims, particularly with respect to the South China Sea, are unfounded, ungrounded in international law, and in many ways audacious and outrageous. But leaving aside the sort of asterisks of China's periphery, I don't think China seeks to take over the world in a kind of a traditional imperial military way. I think its aspirations lie in a different direction. It wants to become strong, powerful, prosperous. It wants to not have to take direction or orders from anyone else in the world, and it wants to be able to operate from a position of, at a minimum, co-equal power, so that it doesn't, have to take guff from the United States or Japan or anyone else. But I think it can do that, and I think it aspires to do that within its boundaries, albeit with a couple of issues very much unresolved, and they probably never will be resolved. Taiwan, the South China Sea are the two big ones. The rest of them are kind of relatively minor border issues, for example, with India, that don't generally flare up and probably never will be resolved, but in a sense may never need to be resolved. Mm-hmm. So, no, to your question, Jacob, I don't think China aspires to world conquest. And I will say, I think the notion that China wants to be the United States or U.S. 2.0 or global hegemon 2.0 is a uniquely American idea grafted onto Chinese leadership thinking by Americans and others, and not a uniquely Chinese idea. But I think that too many people in the United States aren't able to see that we are projecting some of our own inclinations onto China, and it generates this narrative that China is bent on world domination, even though we and not they are the ones that have troops in 150 countries and so forth and so on. But people just aren't able to see this with objectivity because it's a very emotional issue to people, and I think people react to it, and particularly in the political arena, in very emotional ways.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more, but I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate here to push the argument as well, which is, I don't think the United States ever aspired to world domination either. It is something that sort of happened accidentally. We had to get dragged into both World Wars I and II. We only get dragged into World War II because of, Japan bombs Pearl Harbor, and suddenly The U.S. is in the war and it's fighting, basically two wars on two different continents and wins and becomes that sort of power that's at that cusp, and Eisenhower's military-industrial complex, the whole nine yards. But most of American history is rooted in the idea that the U.S. doesn't want to go abroad and do foreign adventuring. We don't want to be this top power. We don't think that anybody should have this sort of level of imperial power. And I guess the question there, I feel like the rejoinder to what you and I would argue about China's intentions are, okay, well, China doesn't want that now, but maybe they will 5 years in the future. Maybe the fact that they're becoming more dependent on foreign imports of everything, like, from food to energy and things like that, means they're going to have sort of a Japan-style imperial project because they're going to have to secure their supply lines abroad. How would you respond to sort of that line of questioning, which I would disagree with it, but it's the one that's most compelling, I think, about thinking about China as a threat from that U.S. perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very deep and thoughtful question. And, I'll say a couple of things in response. Number one, one of the things that I learned in my study of international relations that has always stayed with me and that I think is absolutely true and very explanatory when it comes to any country, but in particular China at this time, is the idea that interests are a function of power. And that as a country becomes more powerful, it will tend to construe and define its interests more expansively. And China's doing that, and that shouldn't surprise any of us. It's just the same way that the United States has tended to define our interests more expansively as our power has increased dramatically in recent decades. And so that's a very natural thing. When you're a big, powerful country, you have the ability to shape outcomes, your interests are going to start to be commensurate with your ability to shape outcomes. So at that level, I can understand and respect the argument that, who knows what will happen 50 years from now, 100 years from now, or 300 years from now. Could China at some point, go down that path as it becomes more and more powerful, and applying this construct, will it then define its interests more expansively, feel the need to have bases overseas and so on? I acknowledge that is possible. None of us, I think, can, predict what's going to happen 30, 50, 100, 150, or 200 years from now. But in the foreseeable future, I think the reason that I think that argument is thoughtful but not necessarily predictive of what China is going to do is that at a very fundamental level, I think China is a very different kind of country than the United States. There is a messianic quality to our thinking in this country and to our understanding of our rightful role in the world. I mean, we see ourselves as the shining city on the hill, the beacon of light, the great arbiter of justice and morality. We write human rights reports. I wrote good portions of quite a few of them in my career, sitting in judgment of every other country in the world and saying what they did right and what they did wrong. And the Judeo-Christian civilizational tradition that undergirds our polity kind of causes us to see the world in moral terms and to think of ourselves as to having a comfort level at this point in time with an activist role to go out there and shape the world in a way that reflects our values. But the fundamental mindset in China, in my judgment, my considered judgment, is very different. It's much more of, I'll mind my business, you mind your business. I have my system, you have your system. I'll do things in a way that works for us. We, the leadership of China, will organize our society as we see fit, and that we, in a way that we believe serves our society well. You organize things the way that you think will serve your society well. And it's a kind of I'm okay, you're okay mindset. It is not messianic. It's just leave us the hell alone and let us do things the way we want, and we'll leave you alone. And that's not the way that America looks at the world. America looks at the world as we're doing everything right, and damn it, you need to do it the same way. And it's that difference, Jacob, between the fundamental way that America looks at the world today, and the way that China looks at the world, that I think causes me to conclude that China, doesn't it doesn't have an interest in doing so many of the things that the United States does in our self-appointed role as world policeman and hegemon of the world. China doesn't want to put boots on the ground in all these other countries. It doesn't want to finance the world. It doesn't want to have targets on its back by being the lead country going after Al-Qaeda and ISIS. It doesn't write human rights reports on other countries because, frankly, it doesn't give a damn about human rights in any other country. It just doesn't care, and it doesn't feel obligated to weigh in on those issues. And the list goes on. So, I think it pulls China in a different direction. And I think the biggest mistake that we often make in the United States is grafting and projecting our own strategic sentiments onto the Chinese leadership in ways that don't fit in reality. But we can't see that because we're too busy assuming that they think exactly the way we do.
Yeah. The last sort of topic of conversation before I let you go is I wanted to sort of take we've been talking at a very high level, and I wanted to bring it down to sort of the next 6 to 12 months because, I think last year was a really, really tough year for China, especially the latter half of the year. They've got a burgeoning real estate crisis. COVID finally reared its head after all those years of keeping it at bay. They're dealing with that on top of it. Xi Jinping had to clear out his political rivals so that he could have his unquestioned, status on top of the machine. And China was clashing with the United States, sort of, it seemed like on almost every level. You had Nancy Pelosi in Taiwan. You had semiconductor restrictions out the wazoo, like all these different things. And at least in the first sort of couple weeks of this year and the last couple weeks of last year, it at least seems to me like there's a bit of a change in tone from China. So they're demoting the wolf warrior diplomats. They're shifting their position on COVID, obviously. They're importing coal from Australia again. There seems to be open lines of communication between the top political leaders and officials in both China and the United States. So do you think that something's up with China in the sense that China sort of understands that it's the weaker power and it's going to have to make some compromises on where it was at? It wasn't necessarily as strong as maybe they thought they were last year. Is that a cause for optimism, you think, in the year ahead for U.S. China relations? Or do you think this is just kind of a blip and that by middle of the year we'll be squabbling with each other just like we were for most of last year?
Well, here's what I would say. I don't personally read the tonal shifts that I think you've rightly noted as an indication of a weakened China or China being in a weaker position relative to the United States. There are a number of things I think happening at once. Number one, it is of course true that 3 years of zero COVID policies have greatly weakened China's economy, have generated incredible frustration and hardship within China, have taken points off of China's growth rates and so on. So that is unquestionably the case, and I think that was a major consideration among others, obviously, that as to why China lifted those policies and terminated those policies, and now is opening its doors as of a few days ago to foreign travel and so on. COVID has had a very negative effect on China in a number of ways, but fundamentally at the economic level, and there's no question about that. But I don't think that is what is causing the tonal shift. I think you're right that there was a different and I think somewhat more positive, or let's say less negative tonality emerging from the first in-person summit between the presidents of the two countries, Joe Biden and Xi Jinping. And I think that was notable because it did stand in pretty sharp contrast to a lot of the vitriol that we've seen hurled in both directions and continue to see in some cases. But I think it was a reflection of, number one, here are these two heads of state that are now meeting in person for the first time. And I think the Chinese respected that moment as an important juncture and moment to take stock of the relationship and maybe see if there are opportunities to move the relationship to a more constructive plane. The fact that the 20th Party Congress was now behind China in terms of the leadership transition, is another factor that I think allows things to maybe loosen up a little bit from a political standpoint, in the sense that, President Xi Jinping now has that really important moment behind him and now can focus on things like the relationship with the United States in a way that's not constrained by thinking about the political process and wanting to keep things smooth in the run up to the party Congress. So that was a factor. But I think it's also true, Jacob, that China understands, and I think the United States increasingly understands, that the great majority of issues that are on the U.S. China bilateral agenda, at least as the United States construes that agenda, are actually irreconcilable. And the bottom line is, you can have 20 presidential summits, and the United States and China are still not going to agree on Taiwan. And we're still not going to agree on the South China Sea or human rights or matters of religious freedom or the issues in Xinjiang or Hong Kong, or for that matter, the state's the appropriate role that a state can and should play in the management of a national economy or trade. I mean, we're just not going to agree on any of these issues. We're never going to agree on them. And so I think, what both sides need to do now is to just recognize that some things are going to be permanent features of the relationship. And at the same time, there are areas where working together can make a positive difference for both countries and for the world. And deciding respectively, the United States on the one side, China on the other, that, we are never going to agree on this set of issues, but it is still fruitful and in our interest to work on this other set of issues. That is the transition that I think may be occurring within the strategic thinking of the United States. And I think we need to get to that place where we recognize that, we can blast China for what they're doing in Xinjiang or for what's happened in Hong Kong over the last couple of years, or any issue that we want to, but it's not going to generate any behavioral change on the part of China. And so once we realize that, the question is, where can we make a difference and how can we actually advance our interests? Where is that possible? And I think that's what is coming out of the end of 2022 and into 2023. And I certainly hope that this pragmatic orientation becomes more prominent in the thinking of both sides, because just blasting each other for things that China does that we disagree with and for things that we do that China disagrees with, it doesn't change anybody's lives and it doesn't make anything better for anybody. So we can keep doing it, or we can focus on how to work together to actually make the lives of the American people better and from China's standpoint, make the lives of Chinese citizens better. And I hope that's where we're going with the relationship as we get into 2023.
Are you optimistic that that's the trajectory of the relationship in 2023?
To be honest, I'm not optimistic about it, at least from a U.S. standpoint. I think China understands the dynamic in some ways better than we do. They know that nothing they say will change how we deal with Taiwan, for example, just as an example, as stated from their perspective. I don't know that we yet know that nothing that we do or say to China is going to affect what they do in Xinjiang or in Hong Kong and so forth and so on. So I think the Chinese are ahead of us in understanding the futility of trying to change the other side where the other side is dug in. But I also think the Chinese, in terms of their mindset, are more comfortable with this, the intractability and the irreconcilability of these issues probably than we are. Because again, with that messianic impulse and that notion that we're always right and the other side, whoever it is by definition always wrong, we tend to, not want to give up until the other side acknowledges that we're right and they're wrong. And China just doesn't operate that way. And so I think they're ahead of us on the continuum of coming to a place of being at peace with the fact that these issues are irreconcilable. My lack of optimism is rooted in what I perceive as a stubborn desire on the part of the United States to cling to this idea that we have to keep, trying to get China to change behavior that in reality we will never get them to be able to change. Whether, again, it would be great if the United States could wave a magic wand and turn China into a Jeffersonian democracy and so forth and so on. That's never going to happen because we don't have the power and the wherewithal to make that happen. So, but I think it's hard for people to give up that aspiration. When I say people, I mean people in policymaking positions and in the legislature. And I think it's in the politics of China and the United States drive the debate and the discourse and legislation and so forth in a very particular direction. And nobody's going to want to be that person that comes out and says, this is great for grandstanding purposes, but it's not solving anybody's problems, because then that individual will be primaried, wiped out politically, and the next person will come in with the same embrace of the well-established narrative that China is the source of all evil in the world. So I'm not optimistic that we're going to get to a better place anytime soon, but I guess, if you bang your head against the wall long enough, maybe there comes a point at which you realize that it's not such a good idea to keep banging your head against the wall.
I guess so. But I mean, last question. I agree with you that, nobody's going to change each other's minds on Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang. The one that maybe could be a step towards maybe building some trust to sort of bring it back to where we were talking earlier is, do you think there's any chance of, and this might be happening already just because of China defining things in terms of its self-interest, not because of anything Washington is telling it. But I think one of the most surprising things in the past year, at least for me, has been, the depth of the relationship between China and Russia, and China's sort of unwillingness to call out Russia on the invasion of Ukraine. I mean, I sort of get it from a strategic perspective, but do you think there's any sort of chance to convince China not to be, I wouldn't say they're exactly supporting Russia, but to at least be a little more critical of Russia, to not be sort of the last commodity export destination of possibility for Russia? Or do you think that China sort of sees that, hey, you've decided we're the peer enemy, we need Russia to stand up on its own to be in this multipolar world, we're not going to go after them even though they violated a sovereign country's borders, and that's something that China explicitly doesn't want, right? Everybody should be in their own corner and not violate their borders. You would think that's an area where China might be able to move at least a little bit. Is any chance or no?
I think the short answer is no. I don't see that happening in the foreseeable future, assuming that the conflict and Russia's, naked and unlawful and absolutely unjustified, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine continues along the same trajectory that we've seen for nearly a year now. I don't anticipate China's positioning on it would change. I think China, the Bush-China Foundation was the first U.S. China nonprofit to come out with a statement sharply criticizing China for making a mockery, an absolute and total mockery of its own stated 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which include the notion of respect for sovereignty and respect for territorial integrity, among others. And we said, China, we said in the statement that China's making a mockery of these principles by not condemning Russia's naked and unlawful and shameful aggression against Ukraine, and that these ideas have no meaning if a country can't stand up in these circumstances and condemn Russia for this horrid act of aggression. And we were the first entity in this country to call upon China to do that. I've said publicly and privately that I think China is undermining whatever credibility it had as a country that had held on to these procedural principles, respect for territorial integrity, respect for sovereignty, and so on, and that it's not in China's interest to allow itself to, in a sense, be made a liar of by its steadfast refusal to condemn this inexcusable aggression perpetrated by Russia against Ukraine. So, and yet they this is where they are, nearly a year after the start of the assault. And I don't anticipate, and I understand the angles that China are coming from, and its strategic calculations, and judging from the very cordial, I would say very, very warm interaction between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin via video summit or virtual summit just not too many days ago, a couple of weeks ago. It doesn't sound like China is going to do anything to shift its position or to be more critical or to stand on principle. And I would not expect that that's going to be something where there is a meeting of the minds between Washington and China. I think China is in the wrong on this one in not condemning this horrible aggression, but they have their calculations, and I don't anticipate that that's going to change. And it's another example, Jacob, of what I refer to as the irreconcilability of most U.S. and Chinese positions on these really critical issues. And, we're just going to have to learn to live with that, and obviously to advance our interests as we as a nation see fit, but also to work with China where it makes sense for us to work with China and where it's in our interest to do so, and to come at the relationship more pragmatically, less ideologically, because we're never going to have ideological alignment, and we're never going to have an alignment of national interests. So, the choice point is, do we just keep doing what we're doing and have the same, and continue to have no impact on Chinese behavior, or do we start to focus on areas where we can make a difference? And, I hope it's the latter course, but I'm not optimistic that it will be in the immediate future.
Well, not the most uplifting episode, but certainly insightful. David, thanks so much for making time. I know you're busy. We really appreciate it, and hope to see you soon.
Yeah, Jacob, thanks so much. This is wonderful, and much respect for all that you do, and looking forward to keeping the conversation going.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.